Dear reader, I'm Tony and this is Book Text. I did a little bit of book shopping this week, so I'm going to share my haul, but first, our word of the day is the word pickthank. Pickthank is a noun. It's obsolete now, and it was mostly used in literature anyway, not necessarily in spoken language, but it meant one who curries favor. So in my mind, that sounds like another way to say brown noser. Might be a kind of a more modern version of a pickthank. But there you go, a pickthank. Hopefully you are not, an annoying pickthank to your friends. So I went to a couple of used bookstores this week. One actually invited me to create a customer pick shelf. So I went through the store and selected 15 to 20 books that I thought looked interesting that I could highlight on one of their shelves kind of in the front area of the store, so that, hopefully they get sold. They get, in my mind, adopted into a good home. And that was a lot of fun. I'll post a picture here of the books that I chose. But I also, while I was there, of course, picked some books out for myself. So I'd like to share my selections with you. First, I selected Mistress Pat by L.M. Montgomery. This is a sequel to Pat of Silverbush. So this kind of follows, it's a little duology. I don't think there's a third book, but this is, Silverbush is a little homestead and Pat is growing up, and this book kind of follows her as she is on the cusp of adulthood. She is 20 years old and is finding herself quite lonely. And I think this is interesting. I believe she works as a school teacher, as you would probably in that time period. Anyway, I'm really looking forward to reading this one. I also picked up another L.M. Montgomery. This is Magic for Marigold, it's the beguiling adventures of a spirited young girl named Marigold. Seems interesting. She was named after the doctor who saved her when she was a baby. He happened to be named Marigold, and apparently she meets someone who claims to be a real-life princess. I just want to read everything L.M. Montgomery, so I'm slowly collecting all her works in these lovely little bantam editions. Then I found a book by Dodie Smith, who wrote I Capture the Castle. This one is called The New Moon with the Old, and it is the story of several young adults whose father has left them, and they are trying to, as they escape the nest, they are trying to navigate the modern world, and I think that's kind of interesting. I believe these stories were written in like the 50s and 60s. This one is published in 1963, so that's the modern world that they're dealing with. It's not too far off from our own, but probably a little different than having to figure out technology and things like that. Then I found a book that I actually already owned, but I don't own this edition. This is an illustrated edition. It's kind of a replica of the, almost a facsimile of the first edition. It is Precious Bane by Webb. So this was popular in the 1920s, and it's the story of Prudence in Shropshire. So it says that a classic story of superstition and hatred, destructive ambition, and most of all, the strength of love. And I really like that it has illustrations. I find these older illustrations really aesthetically appealing, and so I have now this edition of Precious Bane by Webb. This book I was drawn to because of its size. So this is Rebecca West's Black Lamb and Grey Falcon, A Journey Through Yugoslavia. It's nonfiction. It's kind of part travel writing, part cultural commentary, part historical commentary of Yugoslavia. And it was written and published in 1941, right at the beginning of World War II. And there was a lot of upheaval in the Balkan states up to that point. Obviously, there's been a lot of upheaval since that point. So this is going to be an interesting kind of insertion into the middle of that history that I'm familiar with. And I just thought that the dedication was devastating. To my friends in Yugoslavia who are now all dead or enslaved. So this is going to be a very sobering book. It's well over 1,000 pages long, but I'm really looking forward to it. I don't know a ton about Yugoslavia. I do know some about the area around Yugoslavia. I had some friends who were actually immigrants from there, and some refugees, and I just want to learn more about that area of the world, and particularly that era of history. This book is Sister Age by M.F.K. Fisher. It's a vintage book. It's full of short stories about aging. So Sister Age is kind of like the saint that guides you through the aging process, seeing your friends and family die off, dealing with the breakdown of your body and sometimes even your mental or emotional state. And so this is going to be a very sad collection of short stories, I imagine, but it's going to be interesting to see that perspective of life. So this is collected from the 60s through the 80s, so a little bit older of writing. This book is The Swan Thieves by Elizabeth Kostova, and she wrote famously The Historian, which I haven't read, but I do own a copy now. So I've just kind of grabbed this because it sounded interesting. It's a story of mental illness and also art and love. So I'm really enjoying reading books that have to do with art and artists, and this follows Robert Oliver and the women that he left behind. So this is going to be just an interesting read about history and art. Finally, I found a copy of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. So this is a very famous book, Nobel Prize winner, obviously was in Oprah's book club, but this is kind of an epic tale of the Buendia family in the mythical town of Macondo. So it's the story of the rise and fall, birth and death of the town through the history of the Buendia family. Inventive, amusing, magnetic, sad, alive with unforgettable men and women, and with a truth and understanding that strike the soul. Really looking forward to this. This will also be part of my goal to read through my community because of the South American literary tradition. This book I grabbed because of the edition. So it is from the Europa Editions publishing house. It is called Freya by Anthony Quinn. It's the story of a kind of volatile, passionate friendship between two women, I believe at the end of World War II. So the main two characters meet on the jubilant London streets of VE Day, right as that war ended, at least the European front. And I just want to read this little summary. What follows is the seductive story of a competitive and passionate friendship that carries the two women through the war-haunted halls of Oxford, the Nuremberg trials, and the exciting Cultural Revolution of London in the 1960s. So kind of interesting. I haven't read a lot from post-World War II historical fiction. And I've been watching Call the Midwife, which is set in this era, in this place. So it'd be kind of interesting to see if there's any parallels there. A similar book from a similar time period, and from the same publishing house, Europa, is Jane Gardam's The Flight of the Maidens. So this is the story of 3 young women in their gap year before they start their university education, right after World War II has ended, 1946, and they are kind of going out to experience life before they start school. So I thought that was interesting. Again, another kind of post-World War II historical fiction that I don't get to read a lot of. Then I found Thrush Green by Miss Reed in this beautiful edition. So I've been reading a couple of Miss Reed's books, but they're mostly set in Fairacre. So that she has a kind of a Fairacre series, and this one is the Thrush Green series, and this is the first book. It's been compared to the Mitford novels by Jan Karan. In fact, she blurbed the book at the top. So another kind of older, more vintage book, but something I'm looking forward to as a light-hearted read. This book I grabbed because first I recognized the author's name, and second, the premise and the genre intrigued me. It is Oscar Wilde and a game called Murder, a Mystery by Gyles Brandreth. So I think this is technically the second in a series, a mystery series featuring Oscar Wilde. But Gyles Brandreth is a kind of a famous maybe TV personality in England. And he has done a lot of research. He's been politically active. He has written a biography of Oscar Wilde. And so he has written also fictional mysteries featuring Oscar Wilde. This story apparently follows Oscar Wilde and a group of his friends, including Bram Stoker and Arthur Conan Doyle, so contemporary writers. They play a game where, they talk about who they would murder if they were going to murder anyone. And the next day, the first victim that they talked about has been murdered. So that sounds really interesting, and I enjoy kind of fictional depictions of famous authors. This next book I picked up because of the author. She has been recommended to me multiple times. She's from Brazil. So this was translated from the Portuguese. This is Clarice Lispector, The Hour of the Star. So this is a very short book, but it is promising to be very kind of heart-wrenching. The story of a woman who is kind of low class, low born, and kind of pitting her as the pathetic heroine against the urbane, empty narrator. I don't know what to make of this book, but I am looking forward to it. It's going to be really interesting. Again, this will be helpful in reading something from the Brazilian cultural tradition, literary tradition, as I am trying to get to know the Brazilian immigrants in my area better. Then I found a Thomas Hardy book that I've been looking for because I need to read it later this year for a Thomas Hardy project. I found Under the Greenwood Tree. So this is also surprisingly short. There is probably going to be a love triangle, knowing Thomas Hardy, but so far what I can read is that it focuses on a parish choir and the love interest or the romance between the schoolmistress and a member of the choir. And this is supposedly comical? Like, I don't know quite. It's called Delightful and Humorous. Don't know what that means, because I've read a lot of Thomas Hardy and I wouldn't necessarily call them funny. So I'm very intrigued to find out what is funny about this. This book is technically two books in one. It's Susanna Rowson, and the books are called Charlotte Temple and Lucy Temple. So Susanna Rowson was a kind of English and American woman writing in the late 18th century. So this was written, I think, or the first one at least, first published in 1794. So I have not read a lot from women in America from that time period. She's considered an American writer as she moved from England to America and back and so on. But these are the stories of women trying to survive in kind of harsh circumstances in America in that time period. And I'm just intrigued by that. I'm enjoying some late, especially late 18th century writings recently. So this will be a good addition to that. This last book I picked up because I haven't really seen this author a lot while I've been looking through used bookstores. So I snatched it because I didn't know when I would have the next opportunity. Sybil by Benjamin Disraeli. And Benjamin Disraeli was one of the prime ministers of England during the Victorian era, but he was also a novelist. So the subtitle of this book is really interesting. It's Sybil or the Two Nations. And I believe he's trying to highlight the disparity between classes, especially the poor and the rich. So he's focusing on the fact that the nation is basically divided into two, the poor nation and the rich nation, and their different lives and experiences. So I'm kind of intrigued in seeing his approach to the Victorian novel. So there you have it, 16 books added to my collection. I'm really excited about reading all of these and hope to add them to my TBR soon. Remember, there's always another book.